I know you've had a whole bunch of great conversations so far, and I'm really, really honored to be able to join it at the very end. So to begin with, what I'm going to be talking about is the future of liberal education. And to do this, I'm going to combine those two fields, talking about what liberal education looks like and how it's unfolding, but also to explain what this means to think about the future. So again, please, if you have any questions about this, please jump in the chat. So what futurists do is answer this ancient question. What's next? What's happening? What's coming up? And the futurist field is actually pretty interesting. When I ask people what a futurist is, I get all kinds of responses. And if you haven't seen this meme, there are versions of this for almost every profession. And it's a lot of fun to see what people come up with. And this actually does a pretty good job. You can see in the top left, people think either I'm some kind of soothsayer or guru or a robot. You can see from the top right, people actually do think there's something mystical or at least visionary going on. The top middle is a very popular view, which is actually fairly accurate, that futurists focus on technology a great deal. But I think the bottom three images here are more of what I do in practice. My family does think I ask questions a lot, which is true. And I try to stir curiosity and to help people think about the mystery of the future. Now, I do this through all kinds of methods. I share a lot of my work. So I publish scholarly books. I do a weekly video conversation. I do a monthly report. I blog a lot. My idea here is not just to make a noise, but to try to improve my practice by putting out everything I do to get feedback, to see what people think, what I'm missing, what I may overstate, and just to have, above all, a better conversation about higher education's future. So let's start by talking about this. And in fact, let me just ask you all to do something. Um, do you have a shared name for this practice where you ask people to type in something into the Zoom chat box, but don't hit enter until a signal? And then once a signal is given, everybody hits enter at the same time and it all flows down at once.
Phrase I use is waterfall.
Yeah, I've seen waterfall, which is good, and popcorn is another one I've seen. But let me just quickly ask you, when you think of futuring and futures work, what's one word or phrase that comes to mind? And just take a second to type this in. And the phrase could be bizarre or too hairy, or unrealistic or inapplicable or help. I mean, just take a second and now go, hit enter. Scary is good questioning. Good one, Marlo. Absolutely. Uncertainty. Jihan, you know this field. Aaron, very, very good. Speculative. Yes, Alex. Yes. To a fault sometimes and sometimes further still. Good. Oh, good stuff. And scary. Definitely. Well, thank you for this. As we go, please add some more. A key thing to think about is, at least for me and for others, is the plurality of this, that we are not usually looking for one single thing. Now, there is a practice of futures work, which is popular, and sometimes people do this in advertising. Well, they say, this thing will happen. You know, Kenyon College will have this many students, guaranteed. I try to avoid that. What I like to do is open people up to possibilities. Emily Armour in the chat says unrealistic. And that's one of the problems with futures work, is that it can either depict futures that are just ridiculously unlikely to happen, or if they're proven not to come to pass, then they are debunked and they look unrealistic. But I really believe it's important to take a look at multiple possibilities for the future, in part because humanity is incredibly complex and very, very vast. There are billions of us spread out across a good-sized planet. It's possible that multiple futures will happen and coexist. And right now, the futures field as a profession dates back to the 1950s and 60s. We have an armature of many, many different tools and methods we use. Here's just, one snapshot of a whole bunch of these. And I'll walk you through a few of these and apply these to the future of liberal education. There are different disciplines or different associations. This is one that I've been on the board of before. We have conferences, scholarly journals, scholarly books. It's a thin field, but it's well distributed across the world. Uh, a key thing to start off with is our question of language. What do we get to focus on? What words do we use? And of course, words have power. Prediction is often a tell. Some people are happy to use the word prediction. I'm of the school which says we don't like to do that because that implies too much certainty for a very uncertain field. I'm fond of the term futuring as a verb to emphasize that this is a process and a practice that's ongoing. A lot of people like the term forecasting, and that is because weather forecasting has actually gotten a lot better over the past generation. And that's a pretty realistic or pretty accessible mode. People can say, well, we forecast 75% chance of rain. Well, if it doesn't rain, we said 75%, right? And it also gives you a chance of thinking about possibilities, but also about the complexity of the topic. A very popular term, especially in business and the military, is to refer to foresight, which is a really good term that we're trying to give people a sense of literally sight beforehand. I like to show some of the visual shapes and diagrams that we have. I don't mean art yet per se. I mean some of the various forms futures work can take. This, for example, the sigmoid curve is a very, very popular one, a very reliable one, describing the onset of something new. And how it folds out. So you can see that on the bottom left, imagine this playing out over time. Something appears, it's very new. A classic model innovation refers to this as the early adopter phase, and then it crosses over, it grows in adoption until we reach the midpoint of the screen, in which case, it's fairly popular, about half. And then the top right, you can see it becoming dominant, but not completely taking over until it does. This is a useful map for a whole bunch of innovations, not just technological, but social. This is another useful one from the fantastically interesting fellow Stuart Brand. He calls this his pace layers model, which takes a look at the different speeds that different things change at. So, for example, look at the very bottom of this. We can see nature changing very slowly, which is generally true. If you take a look at, say, plate tectonics, or if you take a look at the cryosphere, culture moves a little bit more quickly than that. Governance can move faster than culture. Infrastructure can move quicker than governance. It's fast, famously, it's very hard for governance to keep an eye on technology, for example. Commerce moves more quickly than that still, especially with its focus on quarterly earnings. And fashion moves at a blistering pace, and partly due to copyright reasons. So it's interesting to, just try and approach different developments and how they change over time with these paces. I'm very fond of Gartner's hype cycle. I think this is a fairly tongue-in-cheek model, but I think this is actually more useful than it isn't. If you're not familiar with it, this cross maps time and hype over something. So on the bottom left of the screen, you can see where something appears the first time, something that's brand new. Well, so here, for example, is the idea of smart dust, which hasn't gotten very far. But you can see it climbing in popularity, becoming more and more hyped, more excitement going on, more interest, perhaps TV shows about this, perhaps Time magazine puts it on the cover until it reaches what they call the peak of inflated expectations. And following that point, it may fall. So you can see people become critical, people become skeptical, and it starts to fall down to what they call a trough of disillusionment. And some things stay there and they never come up. Virtual worlds like Second Life are more or less still down there. But if we figure out how to make this thing, whatever it is, more useful, it enters what we call a slope of enlightenment. We figure out what to do with it, and then hopefully ends up in the plateau of productivity. Apple products are the exception here. They just stay at the peak of inflated expectations, or they disappear completely. Like I said, I think this is a tongue-in-cheek idea, but it really does apply pretty usefully to some things. A classic futures leader named Jim Dator came up with his four futures model, and I find this to be very, very useful and apply this in a lot of fields. He gives four different versions of how something could change. One is the transformation model, where something just becomes wildly different and explodes. That's that red line here. Another is where it declines and collapses. And again, this thing could be a government, this could be a fashion, this could be a social movement or technology. The blue line here is the limits in discipline, where something is controlled and doesn't proceed further. You could, for example, think about learning management systems on campuses like Blackboard and Moodle, which have just hit that wall, and they're very productive. We use them, every day, but they're not really changing. They're staying that way. Or they're simply continuation. where something just keeps going and keeps developing. So I've just some cautions and warnings and caveats about this work. Emily Armour put down unrealistic, and this is where you can apply that. For example, when people get excited about a future, that can often lead towards utopian possibilities. And the problem, of course, is that someone's utopia can also be someone's dystopia. My favorite example from this, from the higher education, is the idea of replacing faculty or staff with technology. So for a lot of us, especially teaching faculty, this sounds nightmarish. I mean, not just we could see as a threat to our livelihood, but also a degradation of learning experience. On the other hand, for some people, they may see this as cost savings. And if you're really worried about the cost of higher education, this could be appealing. I think professionally, it's really important to keep in mind both utopian and dystopian extremes and not to stay on one or the other. The other great caution is the black swan idea. And this is coined by the statistician Nicholas Taleb. And this is the idea of something that is statistically very, very unlikely. But when it happens, it has a huge impact. And we can imagine some future events like this. An asteroid strike to the world, for example, is very, very unlikely. But when it does happen, it will have a huge impact. Almost historically, we can find plenty of examples. Almost every world religion is a black swan. You don't see anybody in the Roman Empire around 30 CE saying, yeah, we should have a world-changing religion coming at us from Judea any day now. Nobody in Persia or the later Roman Empire in the 6th, 7th century was expecting anything to come out of Arabia, for example. The financial crash of 2008 is a classic example. We have all kinds of economists in the summer and fall of 2008 saying, everything's fine, nothing bad is going to happen, and then blammo. So it's tricky to anticipate black swans. It's easy to come up with examples of things that are unlikely and might have big impact, but trying to anticipate this ahead of time is difficult. I'm kind of notorious for having done this once. My book before my current book, Academia Next, has what is now a notorious page. This book I wrote from roughly 2016 to 2019, came out in fall 2019. And on page 23, I asked people to imagine a certain thing. I said, imagine an academy after a major pandemic struck the world, perhaps along the lines of the early 20th century's great influenza. And then to imagine the institution under such pressure would to think through multiple disciplines of domains. And you can see the rest of this paragraph. I talk about online learning and changes in sports and so on. And needless to say, nobody paid attention to this page until about March 2020. And then everyone freaked out and asked me, how did I anticipate this? The simple fact is that in the futurist field, we've been thinking about pandemics since the early 1990s. We've been doing workshops, we've been doing exercises, we've written a lot about this. Unfortunately, people didn't take it seriously enough. Another thing to keep in mind is that we get very excited about new things, and we often think about the future as something that's novel. But it's important to recall that the old persists in all kinds of ways. You think about human biology, while we tweak it and adjust it, we're still working with the same kind of frame we've had for millennia. This is a delightful book, The Shock of the Old. It's a very, very cranky book, but the author points out again and again how we rely on older technology. Thinking, for example, World War II, we often talk about mechanized warfare, but in fact, horses and donkeys were still used pretty widespread. I'm a professional futurist, and I keep taking Amtrak, which is about as old and cranky technology as we can get. And of course, in higher education, we often trade on our ancestry. We depend on our old time. Here's a great photo of a classic Kenyon College building. If you watch a movie or a TV show about higher education, it often looks to find ivy-colored walls. That's a key part of what we do in higher education, is rely on that. Now, another tool in our toolkit for futures is what's called horizon scanning, or just scanning. And that's when we research the present and the recent past, looking for data that may point out something of the future. I like to think about this as checking for acorns that grow up to be mighty trees. There are a lot of ways of doing this. And in fact, this is one of the things that futurists do that's most popular. Here's an example from the USDA. Here's an example from the library world. Here's an example from the educational technology world, a very famous Horizon report, now owned by Educause. And there are a lot of ways of doing this. And the key thing is just to look for signals and seeds. In their chat, Alex Alderman said speculation. This is kind of the reverse. This is where we look historically. We look entirely for evidence. And this is a practice that's a really easy one to start doing and a good one to continue developing. So one thing to do, for example, is to check your professional zone to see, if you're a biologist or a historian or a librarian, to see what's emerging there, what signals of the future, what acorns are you digging up, but also your personal life to see what is existing there. I've done this exercise many times with academics where I ask them what kind of technologies they use in their professional life. And usually they'll mention a handful. They'll talk about email, they'll talk about their course management system, and then they'll often say, but I'm not very technologically skilled. I say, okay, fine. Tell me about your personal life. Wow. Then they talk about online banking. They talk about multiple streaming services. They talk about automated vehicles. They talk about being able to, all kinds of stuff. It's really important to combine these. But beyond that, it's really important to situate what you're looking at in broader contexts. So in the futures field, we often use acronyms like this that ask you to look at the social environment around you. So in this case, the social environment around higher education, the technological environment, the economics one, and the environment, literally the green environment, the natural world, as well as politics. You can find versions of this, but I think you get the idea. Um, to take a big example, if we think about geopolitics, geopolitics right now, talking to you in summer of 2024, I think it's obvious to say that things are pretty chaotic. The US military has this fantastic term called VUCA, which means a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And that's becoming more and more true. I mean, it's, I think, pretty easy to show you some examples. I mean, one that the United States is engaged in what some have called a new Cold War with China, and this plays out globally. Here, for example, is China's One Belt, One Road project, which stretches across multiple continents. The US is contesting this in different ways. I mean, it's not, I think, a bad analogy to compare this to the Cold War. We could think about the hot war going on right now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We could think about another hot war going on between Israel and Gaza or Hamas. The point I think here is pretty clear that the world is becoming more and more geopolitically fraught, and we can think about the ways this plays out in higher education. I mean, obviously, most clearly, some of your campuses may have seen very photogenic or very passionate or very contested encampments and protests around Israel's war in Gaza. You may have seen, for example, changes in the flows of international students, difficulties in trying to have collaborations across geopolitical fault lines, say with Russia or with China. A key thing to think about is how much further do these play out? If United States-Chinese tensions expand, for example, do we have a harder time recruiting students from China? Do we instead get incentives to recruit more students from U.S. allies, like, say, India or Japan? Um, another thing that keeps coming up in my own scanning is this interesting emphasis on improving quality of teaching. And in the United States, as well as Europe, a shift away from increasing the quantity of students. That is, I'll come back to this in a bit, a sense that we may have hit a wall or a ceiling with the number of students we can teach. And now our job is to improve the quality. In fact, I haven't been to a country yet where people are satisfied with the quality of their teaching, besides Harvard, which we could just call a country by itself. And this has appeared in different ways in terms of increasing professional development. And that might be through funding, through provost grants, that kind of thing. Building out teaching and learning centers like Kenyon's wonderful center that Joe has nurtured for so well for years. It may involve actually paying attention to and conducting the scholarship of teaching. And it may also include building more wraparound services to support students. I mean, all of these are on the table. All of these are being practiced in different ways. But this is one thing that is not speculative. This is simply in the present, and we can document. And that there are a lot of incentives for this. I mentioned COVID before. There's quite a bit of backlash against the COVID online experience, the blended learning experience. But I think in the United States, there's also anxiety about the perceived cost of higher education and how for that money, for that debt, we should experience highest possible quality. Now, I mean, another situation, another framework to bear in mind is the macroeconomic view. And of course, for me, My PhD is in English literature. It's a delight for me able to be talking about macroeconomics, which I study closely. So one of them is that the workforce is changing. And I know this is controversial in some places to mention, but I think we can all agree that one commonly accepted view of the function of higher education is to prepare students for life. And a lot of that life involves work. Now, to the degree we do that, to the degree we emphasize that, to the degree the workplace demands shape our teaching is something you can argue and talk about. But I think it's important to have this in mind. One of the biggest transformations that we're experiencing is the shift from industry, an industrial economy, an industrial workforce towards not a technological workforce, not a creative or work or cultural or information-based workforce, but a labor force that's dominated by service. And this is one of the most powerful transformations of our time. Has all kinds of implications. You can think about this in terms of the decline of union membership, especially in the private sector. We can think about this in terms of gender. There are all kinds of ways, but it's an important trend or important development we have to keep an eye on. Second is the reduction of long-term jobs towards short-term jobs, or even the gig economy, which Australians refer to as the American economy, very interestingly. But the idea here the idea of having one job, one career, even one employer for life is decreasingly available. And there's also the fact that while relatively few jobs in the United States actually focus on technology, that technology has infused all kinds of jobs. So all of these represent a different labor market that we prepare our students for. Another trend to think about, and this is one that I find not just controversial, but also interestingly and productively controversial, which is to put to demographics. In a sense, what we know about demographics shouldn't be controversial. We have lots of data. Professional demographers have done a fantastic job at this. The insurance industry does a terrific job at this. And we know really, really clearly, we know why and how. Any population that goes through modernity goes through a massive shift in its demographics. Basically, the youth population shrinks and the elder population grows. And we've just seen this all over the world. We're seeing it in the United States. It's masked by immigration because immigration tends to be younger. But the American birth rate has just been declining for years and years. No sign of it building back up. We see this around the world. Where we can look at developing nations that are still in the old school of producing lots of kids. You can see here from this graph that Nigeria, for example, produces a lot of kids, and then mortality sets in, so that you have a lot more babies, a lot more infants than you do elders. But once you go through modernity, you take this pyramid and you flip it upside down. So that you have fewer and fewer kids, more middle-aged people, more seniors. I mean, the implications for this we can talk about. They're endless. But when it comes to higher education, obviously this means that the pipeline of traditional age undergrads, the kind that go to Kenyon or Williams, that pipeline is narrowing. And nothing is turning that around. If you want some comedy, by the way, go to YouTube and look for the Danish government's commercials to convince Danes to have more kids. It is intentionally and unintentionally hilarious. My favorite bit is the slogan, "Do it for grandma." But these have all failed, and we don't have a way of reversing this. Now you can take these points, these signals, these seeds, and then you can arrange them in time and turn them into trend. A trend is simply a force, a driver that is having some impact on the likely future. And again, you ground this with evidence. You build this up with data. And by the way, before I go further, just quickly in the chat, how am I doing so far? Is this too fast, too slow? Do you want me to go back? Do you want me to speed up? Just give me a quick note in the chat. And if I've put you all to sleep in a narcotic haze, then if there's no response, that tells me I've succeeded that way. Yeah, Emily, thank you. Thank you, Jehan. Good. Good. Thanks, Marla. Glad to hear it. Yeah, if I've caught you doing it for grandma, then please don't let me interrupt. I do trends analysis. That's a lot of my work. It's kind of the core of it. That's what I often write about and publish about. Here's my monthly report where I do this. And I cover right now nearly 100 trends. You can see through here that I look at education in its context. I look at technology in a lot of ways. I look at what's sometimes called the higher education crisis, the higher education bubble. I'm not going to read this slide to you. The key thing is just to show you that there's a lot of ground to cover. And there are a lot of trends. And let me just share a few of these right now. One of them is the increasing skepticism about higher education. And you can find this through surveys and polls of all kinds. This is one, for example, from the Wall Street Journal in Newark, which asking the same question over time, you could see that higher education being seen as worth the cost has been the percentage of people who see this have been decreasing, and people who think that it is not worth the cost has been increasing and is now a plurality. You can take a look at another trend, which is total enrollment in American higher education. And that peaked around 2011, 2012, 2013, and has gone down every year since. This past academic year, it has rebounded by about 1.5%, but overall, we're in a slope of declining enrollment. You can take a look at another trend, which is a shift in what classes students take when they do enroll. And I think you're all familiar with various forms of this graph. This won't surprise any of you, I think, but just really, really quickly, this is from Ben Schmidt. He's taking a look at changes in degrees awarded. There are other ways to measure this, like population and classes and number of majors, but just focus on degrees for a second. And the change is the horizontal axis. So if you look at the top right, these are the fields that are increasing. And by increasing, by the way, I don't mean by 1%. Let's think of the ones that are increasing 30, 50, 75, 100, more than 100%. And none of these fields will surprise you. Computer science, nursing, exercise science, health and medical, engineering, math, you can see a point. Now, if we look at the bottom left, these are fields that are decreasing in terms of degrees awarded. Let's look at the ones that are decreasing by 25, 30, 40%. Religion, the humanities, history, English, languages other than English, religion. It's pretty clear that you can see the motion, the students voting with their feet, moving towards STEM and business, and especially allied health, and away from the humanities. We can talk about how is this a bad thing, a good thing, but it's a thing. It is a trend. We can also look at discount rates. And a good thing to do is to know your institution's discount rate, especially as it changes year by year. But this is, of course, the percentage that we discount rates for the average or median student, depending on how you count this, based on the sticker price of institution. And you can easily see that discount rates have been increasing steadily, incrementally, but steadily year after year. In fact, the median student now pays less than half of what a campus putatively charges. So a question you want to ask yourself is, when you're looking at these trends, is which of these is the most powerful? That is, has the most impact on, well, either you and your work professionally or your institution. Another thing to do is to, well, I'll come back to that, but I will just put forth for you the idea that the biggest trend right now, the one that we have to cope with, the one that academics are too silent about, is climate change, the climate crisis. What you're seeing here, for example, is a photo of a weather station maintained by the U.S. Weather Service in Massachusetts. You can see the weather station on the right, and you can see the Atlantic Ocean on the left. And the reason I put this here is because the U.S. Weather Service decided to give up on this station. That is, it's right near the Atlantic Ocean. What should they do as sea level rise is a given? Should they try and move it inland? Should they elevate it on stilts? Should they put a barrier wall? And they decided, no, it wasn't worth it. They're basically planning on letting it be taken by the sea. I've written a scholarly book about it, the first monograph on the topic, which of course, my publisher would be remiss if I didn't mention this to you. I cover this from a wide range of areas, talking about the impact of climate change on our physical plant, our physical campus, how we intersect with it in terms of our research and our teaching mission, but also how our public mission, our community relations get to appear. I'm not going to walk you through this image. Of course, you have a book you can read about this, but my point is that this is an enormous trend. It is a problem that is so large, philosophers have actually coined a new concept for it called hyperobject. And this is one that we have to grapple with. Now, another way of approaching trends is to ask which of these are the hardest to predict the outcome of. I mean, demographics is not one of these. Demographics is pretty locked in, but some of these are really, really chaotic. And those are the ones that get very, very interesting to think about. For example, here is a flow chart I built last year. Because I'm a child of the 70s, I have to have flow charts, right? And this is one taking a look at generative AI. And I wanted to imagine some of the short-term directions it could take. Not long-term, but just in the next few months. So if you look at the colored boxes on the top left, for example, is what happens to training data sets. Do we manage to continue building enormous data sets? Or will we decide that the data sets have intellectual property or privacy concerns? And you can see if you just follow these lines here that if they get more gigantic, they may become black boxes, harder to penetrate, and we'll have the status quo maintaining. Or we could make them smaller, in which case they're more easily accessible to people. It's possible that we get other versions of AI that are based on open source. If you take a look in the top right, you can see a bright red box. That's how we culturally apprehend AI. And I just have two choices here. Do we have significant opposition to it or not? Right now, we so far have a pretty significant opposition. If you poll people about AI, it polls very badly. If you ask people in higher education about it, they're terrified of it. And this often can shape policy. This can shape society. It's possible that we'll see AI become mainstream, become industrial scale, or it may become marginal. I'm putting this out here just to show you that this is one of those trends, the growth of generative AI, that is hard to predict. It's hard to forecast simply because we have all these forks in the road. Now, a third way of thinking about the future is in some ways the most comprehensible, the most humane, or the most human, which is scenarios. A scenario is just a story about the future. There's a whole history of this we could talk about. In the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. Department of Defense and think tanks helped promulgate this way of thinking when they were trying to understand nuclear war. In the 1970s, a famous futurist named Pierre Wack came up with some scenarios for Shell Oil, which really transformed the oil industry. For a generation, the Global Business Network was an enterprise that was creating all kinds of scenarios. But these are appealing because they're stories and humans are creatures of stories. And it's much easier to view and imagine a future through story form than it is from a trend. Often we create a story, a scenario based on a particular driver, that is a trend that we think is reshaping the world. For example, here's one that I keep coming back to. What if video becomes the dominant way that we communicate? As a friend of mine likes to say, what if video becomes the new paper? This, by the way, is a screenshot of a liberal arts college's video wall for its athletic history, which is pretty impressive. But we have to think about this. If we assume just this driver of increasing video use grows, we're partaking of it now through Zoom. What happens down the road? Do we start producing more scholarly content in video? Do print publications begin to decline further and further still? What happens to audio as an alternative to video? I mean, you could really imagine a world this way pretty easily. In higher education, I like to imagine what would happen if the open movement wins. That is open educational content, or OER, open access and scholarship, and open teaching. What kind of world results from this? Here's a quick scenario. I've shown this to people. I think this is exciting. Most people think it's absolutely dull, but here, let me just run with it, see what you think. What if the medical sector, the full medical sector, allied health, everything else, psychology, nursing, surgery, all of that becomes the leading US industry? And in this scenario, I imagine it taking up almost half of GDP. There are a lot of ways how this could happen. One is our terrible, unusual financial structure. That is, we pay more and more for healthcare than anybody of our peers, and we get, of course, inferior outcomes, both in terms of personal health and public health. We also have the demographic trend I mentioned before, that we are aging, and the older we get, statistically, the more healthcare we consume. Well, we can also imagine more treatment improvements, which are just amazing to see, very exciting. We could see more of that continuing, longer lifespans and people being saved from things that used to kill us. We can imagine a greater presence in society. Just one thing I wanted to ask you just to keep an eye out for is wherever you go in America, look for drugstores. They are now in many ways our churches. That is, they are a building which is everywhere and which people go to as a kind of general store, in fact. We also have Beaumont's cost disease problem. That is, it's hard to scale up healthcare. You don't want your surgeon or your nurse to proceed too quickly. So we need more and more people to work in this field, which means it expands economically. We can think about in higher education that this means more healthcare programs. Everything from psychology, which continues to expand, to new forms of healthcare, and of course allied fields like medical healthcare and people jumping in on healthcare, like philosophy, teaching classes in medical ethics, and this could also lead to more technology because allied health is enormously technology dependent. We've seen this before historically. Here's one year where the greatest number of faculty hires were in the health professions. We can imagine more healthcare teaching and research across the curriculum, classes in the history of healthcare, for example. And also, since allied healthcare tends to be cultured as feminine, that's how we often gender it. And for good reason in some ways that historically we've often associated women with being part of the caring professions or dominating the caring professions. And we've also seen just the sheer number of women employed in multiple fields of healthcare. That may link up interestingly with the fact that roughly 60% of our student body now is female. We may also see some interesting space sharing happening. During summer, we have our physical plant. We make it more available to clinics and hospitals, as well as vice versa. I have this cute thing I do where I take Beloit College's mindset list. They have a new name for this now, where you try to imagine what the typical 18-year-old's world is like. And so I'm trying to imagine that these 18-year-olds in this scenario of Healthcare Nation, they took pre-med classes in high school. In fact, just last month, Bloomberg Philanthropies announced it was starting up healthcare themed high schools in New York. For them, medical heroes might be as important as sports figures are for people. And many of them may be familiar with elder care practices from their community and from their family. Okay, keeping on. You can do a lot more with scenario creation. You can make it more complex by taking two trends and using it to produce four different scenarios. There are a lot of versions of this. This is a pretty popular thing. Here's another one, for example, in technology. But I want to add one more method, one more aspect to this, which is the role of speculation and the whole field of speculative fiction, what we can call science fiction. And this is a little controversial depending on where you are. I know in my field in English literature, it's still controversial, especially in the United States. But it's really clear that one of the cultural functions of science fiction is to help us imagine a different future. And there are all kinds of examples of this from print, from television, from movies. Here, just to pick two popular ones, Doctor Who is going through a renaissance right now. And on the right is the Foundation novels. By the way, don't watch the Foundation TV show from Apple. It's horrible. Just read the first three books and you'll be good. Because we're talking about Kenyon, I do want to cite one of my favorite science fiction writers, Joan Slonczewski, a great writer, a great researcher, and great teacher who has written a whole series of novels. I'm just a huge, huge fan. And here is one where she imagines a liberal arts college in Earth orbit. And it's above Ohio, so there's a little link there. And if you haven't read this, it's a delight. There's a lot of great stuff going on, following a student in her first year at this liberal arts college in orbit. My point is we can learn a lot from science fiction. And if you don't like science fiction, keep in mind how influential it is for the rest of the world. My favorite example of this is when Apple and Sony were suing each other about who invented the tablet computer first. One of Sony's lawyers wheeled in a monitor and showed a scene from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, where astronauts clearly have tablet computers. The point is, science fiction influences us and shapes the world, and you can learn a lot about futures from it. Now, I'd also like you to think about possibilities that go beyond trends. And in order to do this, let me just quickly see if I can do this properly. A little AI exercise here. What I've done is I've asked ChatGPT to help me out with something. And I want to just show you how this works. Let me see if I can share the screen well enough. Yeah, I think this is it. Okay, can you all see this screen?
Looks like we're looking at your web browser. Please
Yeah,
simulate me presenting to an academic audience.
that's it. That's it. Okay, so if you haven't seen this before, this is something you can do. I asked ChatGPT this question. I'm only going to read parts of this out loud. I said, please simulate me presenting to an academic audience about the future of liberal education. You, ChatGPT, will create and describe an online academic venue complete with individual characters. You will summarize my presentation for me, then have the characters ask questions. You will let me answer these questions, then assess my responses. So that was my question. So here's what happened. Online academic venue, the Global Liberal Education Symposium, GLES. This is a prestigious annual event, obviously, held virtually to describe the evolving dynamics and future prospects of liberal education. This year's symposium takes place in a sophisticated online platform designed to seamlessly facilitate interaction among participants. The interface features multiple virtual rooms for presentations, panel discussions, networking spaces. Attendees include academics, policymakers, and practitioners from around the world. Not bad so far. Characters, Dr. Elena Forsberg, a Swedish educational theorist known for her work in interdisciplinary studies. Professor Rajiv Malhotra, an Indian economist focused on the financial sustainability of liberal education. Dr. Laura Bennett, an American sociologist who researches the impact of liberal education and societal innovation. Here's my presentation where I summarize this. Not a bad job, not a bad job so far. I could say more about all these points, but there it is. Now here come the questions from characters. Leonard Facebook, you propose integrating technology extensively in liberal education. Here's your question. Professor Rajiv's question. Dr. Laura Bennett's question. So your turn to answer these questions. Well, I answered Elena Forsberg with this answer here. We should support humanities faculty through professional development, increase teaching about technology, and increased research. We should also make sure to approach technology through an interdisciplinary way. It's assessment. Well, here are my strengths. I emphasize faculty development and interdisciplinary approach. Very, very good. And here's where I can improve. I can mention professional development, provide specific examples of these. For example, here's one. Also, student engagement, which I didn't really address at all. And then a little summary. Overall, here's how you did. And then ask me for my next question. So I respond to another one. It gave me an assessment there and all that. And I wasn't completely happy with this. So I asked it if he could assess my last response more critically. And boy, howdy, it did. It tore me apart, really. It just went through this. Here's my strength of a topic, but areas for improvement. I lacked specific educational strategies. Here's what I could do. I didn't mention societal impact. Here's what I could do. I didn't mention evaluation and assessment. I could do that. Resource allocation. And here's what I could do. I could have gone on with that still further. I could have asked it, I could have tweaked it and honed it in a few different ways. But instead, for your benefit, I asked it to draw the simulation. So it quickly coughed up this illustration on the spot. My point here is not to praise ChatGPT. My point is not to say you should all do this, although the prompt here of asking people to simulate things, that's a very, very powerful prompt, which people just are not paying enough attention to. It's really easy to do. My point here instead is just to say we should be open to the possibilities of the future in ways that go beyond just trends. We should be aware of a lot of creativity and a lot of possibility. Now, here's an example of that, just still further. Just quickly in the chat, how many of you are familiar with the term solar punk? Now, I'll put it in there, in fact. Solar punk. Have you seen that? Have you run into it anywhere? Oh, Jihong has to leave. I'm sorry, Jihong. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate this. Thank you. Anybody else run into the term solar punk anywhere? No? That's okay. No? Okay. Well, what I recommend doing is I would Google the term and look at the images that come back, do an image search for it. The idea of solar punk is to have a positive climate change future. It's not a Pollyannish idea, yay, everything's going to be fine. No, quite the opposite. But the idea is to make it the best, the most humane future we can. So as we think about every conceivable response from flying to economics to politics, if we could try and make it the best possible future. And I just recommend Googling the term and just seeing some of the different responses. So here's me asking ChatGPT to generate a solar punk campus. And what's interesting is here you can see the buildings are covered with two things. They're covered with solar panels. So this is a campus that's actually generating its own electricity, which is unusual for the United States. You can also see a lot of greenery, that there are plants and trees embedded throughout this building. This is a new idea. It hasn't caught on in higher education. I've done some workshops on it. But my point is to just give you that imagination, to think, what would it be like to rethink your college or your liberal arts environment to do that? All right. Let's focus a bit more on liberal education, then I want to wrap things up. So when we talk about liberal education, this is a famous thing we love to say, well, what is it? What do you have in mind by liberal education? And we have a lot of different versions. I'm pretty fond of this idea that is a way of teaching agility, intellectual and personal agility, so people can move across different boundaries, intellectual and professional. Here's one cartoon example of that. We have other ideas. So for some people, liberal education means liberal arts colleges. And there are others that aren't liberal arts colleges that are liberal arts colleges in a way. You think, for example, about a few universities like, say, University of Mary Washington or University of Richmond or Wesleyan University that are clearly liberal arts colleges. You could think about the American university system abroad, like American University of Al Hawaiian or American University of Beirut, American University of Cairo. They call them universities, but they're clearly liberal arts colleges. And maybe that's what it is. We're the ones that do that. For some people, it's the interdisciplinary world, where the idea is that if you go to a community college or a university, non-liberal arts university, you're probably going to focus on one particular path, but we expose you to more disciplines. It may be that liberal education means a more student-oriented, more student-centered university. We have a higher standard of care, and we tend to respond more carefully. We have a high-touch environment. And for some people, liberal arts just means the humanities. That's a definition I reject, but that's a popular one. You hear this a lot. And so when we think of the future of liberal education, we have to think about these different senses, how these unfold. So if we're thinking back, for example, to the sense of agility, this for me seems to address the increasing connection between liberal education and career preparation, and the argument we make that if you are trained for one job for life through one major and one narrow career preparation, you're not going to be suited for the actual labor economy, where you're going to be hopping across multiple disciplines and domains and more likely multiple jobs, I mentioned before. If we're thinking about the future of liberal arts colleges, about these institutions, then we have to dive really deeply into their economics and their local communities and so on. If we're thinking about interdisciplinarity, we have to think about how we structure that kind of motion across disciplines and how we do that in terms of research and teaching. If we want this to be student oriented, then we have to think about how to fund it, how to make it work successfully and productively. If we're thinking about the humanities, well, we're in trouble, generally speaking. I mean, so we could say more about this, but my point is, well, I just want to unpack that and unfold this a bit more. Uh, we can also situate liberal education within the broader academic ecosystem. So the challenges that are facing all of higher education also impact us. So while a given liberal arts institution might not have a lot in common with the community college down the road, they're both struck by the increasing politicization of higher education, the decreasing faith in higher education. If you're a private institution and public funding begins to decline or continues to decline rather, then that impacts you, perhaps as competition or as a competitive advantage. If we're thinking about flexibility, that means we have to think about flexibility in a world that's increasingly demanding flexibility. In fact, liberal arts graduates, I believe, are best prepared for the 21st century. And we also have to be thinking about our vulnerability. And our vulnerability on many, many different points, from funding to popular attitudes to community relations. I think one thing that looks pretty locked in is our sense of greater standard of care and wraparound services. This seems to be spreading across higher education, but I think we're really at the forefront. You can see here an image from Georgetown. They have the idea of cura personalis, care for the whole person, which is very popular there. And you can see this in parts of Catholic education, but I think this is pretty much true across the way. And this plays out in terms of increasing mental health care, perhaps support for student activism, although of course that's tricky to do now. And it's also a way of retaining students as well as attracting them. But I'd like to wrap up here by summarizing this in terms of an active imagination, which I think liberal education prepares students for, but I think working in liberal arts colleges and universities also demands. I'd like us to imagine inhabiting different worlds. And the world may be a small world. It may be the world of my department at this institution. It may be the world of a campus with only 1,000 or fewer than that students. It may be the larger world of your region or your state or the nation or the whole planet. But think about imagining those worlds and inhabiting them down the road. What it's like if we live in a healthcare nation, if AI continues, if geopolitics becomes even more dangerous and so on. But imagine yourselves in that world, of those worlds, Imagine your institution, maybe not in orbit, but in a different world. Imagine the next generations and the generation after that. This is a work of great imagination. I think it's a necessity to do right now. I hope the Futures World helps you, and I hope this presentation has helped you in that work of imagination. Now, let me just stop here. I would love to instead hear from you, to hear your thoughts and your questions. If you'd like me to go back to any previous point that you'd like to dwell on, if you'd like to expand on or push back on, or if there's something that we missed that you'd like us to describe and pursue further, please either, Joe, I was going to say use the chat box, but I'd be happy if anyone wants to turn on their camera and their microphone too.
Yep, everybody can turn on camera and mic if they wish.
And hello, George, and hello, Alex.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for this presentation. May I quickly ask a quick question? If okay, can
Please.
you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
All right, perfect. So you said the slide about the new approach to how we handle students and acknowledging, issues like mental health, personality, etc. I find it quite fascinating because I always end up, I get to meet my students personally. We get to discuss in the classroom. One of the questions I always ask them is, how stressed are they? And they all raise their hands, with various treatments, etc. Do you think practices addressing such condition, like the stress that the students, they come to my classroom usually after work because they're graduate students, and they're all continuously checking emails and continuing their work and being all over the place. Do you think there should be practices incorporated in the classroom to address, to help first of all get everyone aligned with a better state, and then potentially even revisit that during the session? Not sure if I'm going too far with that, but if you see
No, I think this is great. George, what do you teach and where?
I teach communication at the American College of Greece, and I also run the graduate program in advertising. So most of my courses are late in the afternoon, from 6:30 onwards in the evening until 9:30.
I haven't been to it. Is the American College of Greece, is that in Athens? Or?
It's the best college in the universe, of course.
Of course.
It's in Athens. It's in the north. I don't know.
Excellent.
In the 60s, it was transferred to a hillside around Athens. If you have been in Athens, then you'll understand how important it is to be near the trees up in the mountains in the city.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's a beautiful campus. Yeah.
I used to, for a couple of years, I was a Byzantine studies student. So I learned classical Greek, and I know a little bit about the difference between Katharevousa and Demotica, and I would love to visit. George, your question is a fantastic one, and it's one that we hear across the United States and also in some other countries. I think that in the classroom itself, we have a few different options. But it's important to recognize that we are in the classroom is a node inside of a larger institution, and we have to really draw on the campus for support. I don't think any faculty member outside of the discipline of psychology was trained in improving students' mental health. I don't think we have that skill. And we need to have support, and it may be that I've heard this referred to as EMT, mental health. That is, how to deal with an emergency with a student who's freaking out, who has a crisis. We have to be better aware of what our students have access to in terms of mental health on campus. An institution has to do so. It's really important, first of all, just to have that institutional context in mind. A second thing is, now, I am not a mental health professional. I should, after a presentation like this, I should probably seek one. But I think one of the, one of the great challenges we have is that I've seen cited a great deal. And so from what I've studied and experienced might be good is to re-embody our students in the classroom. Most of our work across higher education is very intellectual, as it should be. Very cognitive, but it often leaves our bodies behind. So there's been a great deal of practice of rearranging classrooms physically to allow more student movement in all kinds of ways. Joe puts in the chat, mind over monsters, and I would, and he puts it right there in front of me. You can't miss it. I would, Joe, do you know her? Are you in contact with her? With Sarah Rose Kavanaugh?
We have not met. Is she at Simmons now?
Okay, I'll have to reach out to her. But my point, George, is that some different embodiment practices come highly recommended. In terms of technology, probably the thing about technology in the classroom is that the research on it is all over the map. It's very, very political. It's often very hype driven. Michael Hart has this new book where he claims that we should just get rid of cell phones and extent. And the book is wildly controversial, in part because people are challenging its research, which looks pretty bad to me so far, to be honest. And I like, Jonathan Hart. And I like his previous work. I'm a little disappointed with this. So we have to figure out new practices for this. And we've been doing this for about 20 years. We've had a lot of technology in the classroom. Just one more point to add. I think student work is a great way to treat mental health. By that, my favorite example of this came from Colorado College. I don't know if any of you are from there. Their president, Song Richards, was telling me that they had a lot of her students come to them very concerned about the climate crisis, as they should be. And just, it's interesting, by the way, if you poll people by age, the younger they are, the more concerned they are about the climate crisis. It's pretty reliable. So people over 60, it's not a very big deal. People under 30, it's a huge deal, just to simplify.
Yeah.
So she had
Makes sense.
them do actual work on the climate crisis. They had to teach local K through 12 students about it, for example, and they reported their mental health improving as a result. I think the more work we can find that is intellectually rigorous, of course, and fits into this, I think is a very, very powerful way to proceed.
Yeah.
Alex points out that Haidt is on the bestseller list. Yeah, he's all over the place. But I'm very cautious of this. I've studied the history of technology. I teach a class in technology. I find in many ways, and George, you can come up with all kinds of ways that people have freaked out about technology, about communications technology, in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
So let me stop. I'm not an expert.
No. That's an excellent point. An excellent point. Yeah. To tell the truth, I was while you were talking about these activities, I was thinking, for example, I think at least once a year, I've had the opportunity to put as a brief to my students, for a project, something around mental health. For example, let's do a campaign for Stress Day, the World Mental Health Day, etc., which gives them the opportunity to explore themselves, study, discuss with each other, etc. Yeah. So that's a very good point.
It's also in your field. I mean, there's different arguments.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
communication media worsen.
Exactly. Each of us can tackle it through their own subject, let's say.
Oh, that's
raise awareness. Yeah, essentially.
And thanks for joining us in what must be 7 p.m.
Yes, indeed. 7 p.m. on a Friday. Double sacrifice, but I really enjoyed your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
In the chat, Marlo Daly Galliano, I hope I got that right, loves the focus on potential imagination. Yeah, we should be all about this. This should be crucial to what we do. I think one problem we face in trying to think imaginatively or creatively is that higher education is in many ways in a defensive mode. We see ourselves under attack in different ways, from state defunding to conservatives on the right to anti-intellectualism to sustainability of all kinds of things, and often a very human response. And here I am, George, getting into psychology again. My apologies. Is to double down, is to protect what we've got, and not to reach out and do something else. But I think that's a very, very important one to mention. What else? Again, and Joe mentions the defensiveness against the pile of grading, the scholarly expectations, which, depending on where you are, may be accelerating. Yeah.
Bryan, I might ask you if you'd be willing to riff on that a little more. Your weekly Future Trends Forum is a fantastic. It's a fantastic series of events, but more importantly, it's a fantastic community where the same people keep coming to an hour-long webcast every Thursday. And relationships start to get built, and people start to understand each other differently. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about creating community spaces where people can engage, and particularly engage with something that's more than, I need to learn something I can use in class this semester or next. Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how to make that kind of longer
Sure.
feature community work.
I can talk about it, and I can describe it, and I can talk about what utterly fails, and then I'll talk about some of the things that have succeeded. The Future Transform is a weekly video conference. It's like this. We use a different technology, but it's the same idea. But what's different is we have one guest or a couple of guests, and then I'm the facilitator. I'm not the speaker. I'm just the connector. And then we have dozens or hundreds, up to 800 people in the audience. And what we do is we don't have a PowerPoint presentation. Instead, it's entirely conversational. And this takes some work. This takes some doing. But I think it's extremely powerful because we get to see people by their voice and by their face, and they're also their environment, their immediate physical environment, which makes them more humane, I think, more present as a person. And then I ask a couple of questions just to get the ball rolling, but the key thing is to give it over to the audience for them to ask questions. And we've covered every conceivable topic in higher ed. We've covered everything from professional development to libraries to pedagogy to macroeconomics to AI to code, and we've covered just all kinds of great stuff. And we have more coming up. And by covered, we're our 9th year of doing this. So we have 401 recordings right now on YouTube. So it's been going on for a bit. Things that don't work. It's a video event, live video, and we record them, put the recordings up on YouTube. What doesn't work is trying to follow up by email or by the web. So I will take recordings and summaries and post them to my blog. No one responds. I try to create an email list for it. No one's interested in this. I've put it on Slack. No one cares. It's good to know. People just, what doesn't work is good to know. I think what makes it work, and by work, we have 9,000 people on our email database right now. That is smaller than the number of people who've experienced it because people can unsubscribe. People have done. So I would say we've probably had 20,000 people involved. A key thing is the presence of human beings. We use technology that makes people look bigger on screen. So, and without going into too much detail, I think that's very convincing. But also that it's about conversation is what we do as humans. We converse. And we don't have to be on screen for it. People communicate in different ways through chat and through Q&As and that kind of thing. But also, I think it's really important that the whole stance is communal. We believe in grappling with the future of higher education through community conversation. And so people who are interested in that jump out, and that's fine. People who would rather see a video and just watch it and take it in, they can do that somewhere else. That's fine. But it's where people want to talk and listen and develop ideas together. I also encourage the heck out of networking, and people have gotten jobs as a result. People have gotten publication contracts as a result. They're constantly throwing ideas back and forth and contact information. And I think that matters a great deal. It's kind of like when you go to a conference, the best thing about it are those hallway moments or right after a presentation when you storm the stage and you grab the person and talk to them. That's the focus. That's what it does. I think well, let me stop talking about it because I'm very passionate about it. I mean, it takes a chunk of my life, but I think there's a need for that. There's a need for that kind of conversation. And if you look at the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Inside Higher Ed, they do great reporting and really important stuff, but they don't have a social function anymore. They cut that off. And I think the awful coverage of higher ed in the press, in TV and radio, podcasts, on the web, I think for me personally, it spurs the idea to have something better than that. And I think enough people want to do that for more. Let me stop branding, Joe. What more can I answer about that? What more can I say? And anybody else who has heard about this or has experienced it, please jump in.
As I was taking notes, I wrote down words like conversational, real time, the right people stay, and make something better than what else is on offer. I think as I start wondering how I can get people to think further at Kenyon than like doing 5-year strategic planning is pretty ambitious for us most of the time. And I think some of these are useful ways to think about it going forward.
Yeah, I think so. And the liveness is important. People do use the recordings, and that's great. I'm really glad of that. But by far, the majority happens live, and people want that. Alex in the chat says Inside Higher Ed cut off their comments in February 2020. People's final comments were choice, and this is true. I think this was a mistake that Inside Higher Ed did this. But what's interesting is some people who I used to talk with in the Inside Higher Ed comments sections have moved to the Future Trends forum. In fact, there are a couple of them who email me daily, and we have conversations. So I mean, I'm kind of glad that maybe it's a refugee site. We don't have new space for that.